There's a photograph that sits in a courthouse archive in rural Pennsylvania. It's from 1931, a wedding photo. The bride is 17 years old, wearing a simple white dress with lace sleeves. She's smiling, but if you look closely at her eyes, there's something else there, something that doesn't match the occasion. The groom stands beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder with an unmistakable possessiveness. He's 72 years old, his name was written in the marriage certificate, and when researchers finally cross-referenced the birth records 3 generations later, they discovered something that made the county clerk physically ill. The groom was her grandfather. This isn't folklore. This isn't an urban legend whispered around campfires. This happened, and the town knew. They all knew. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What you're about to hear is a story that was deliberately erased from public memory. A story that represents one of the darkest corners of American family history, where poverty, isolation, and a complete moral collapse created conditions that allowed the unthinkable to become routine. This isn't just about one family. It's about an entire community that chose silence over justice, reputation over truth, and complicity over courage. The girl's name was Dorothy Mae Hutchins, the man's name was Samuel Hutchins, and between them lies a web of genealogical horror that took researchers nearly 60 years to fully untangle. Because Dorothy Mae wasn't just marrying a relative, she was marrying into a family tree that had been folding in on itself for 3 generations, a bloodline that had become so isolated, so desperate, and so morally untethered that what happened to Dorothy Mae was simply the most visible symptom of a much deeper rot. This is the story of how an entire town buried its darkest secret, how they protected the monster, how they blamed the victim, and how for nearly a century they almost got away with it. Crestfall, Pennsylvania doesn't appear on most modern maps. It's not because it disappeared, it's because it was never significant enough to remember. In 1931, it was a dying coal town tucked into the Appalachian foothills, population barely scratching 400 souls. The mines had started closing in 1927, the railroad stopped coming through in 1929. By the time Dorothy Mae Hutchins was born in 1914, Crestfall was already a ghost town that just hadn't realized it yet. The people who stayed were the ones who had nowhere else to go, no money, no prospects, no way out. And in that kind of desperation, in that kind of isolation, the normal rules start to bend. Then they break. Then they disappear entirely. The Hutchins family had been in Crestfall since before the Civil War. They owned land once, back when land meant something. By the 1920s, all they owned was a 2-room shack on the eastern ridge, a half-acre of rocky soil that wouldn't grow anything, and a reputation. Samuel Hutchins was known in town as a hard man, a mean drunk, the kind of man who'd beat his mules until they bled, then beat his sons for not working them hard enough. His wife, Margaret, had died in 1919 during the influenza outbreak. After that, Samuel raised his children alone. Or rather, he didn't raise them at all. He used them. His eldest son, Thomas, left home at 15 and was never heard from again. His daughter, Ruth, stayed. She had no choice. By the time she was 16, she was running the household, cooking, cleaning, and enduring whatever her father decided she owed him for the roof over her head. In 1913, Ruth gave birth to a baby girl. There was no father listed on the birth certificate. The town midwife who delivered Dorothy Mae later told her own daughter years afterward that she knew exactly who the father was. Everyone knew, but no one said a word. Because in a town like Crestfall, you didn't accuse a man like Samuel Hutchins of anything. You just looked away. You kept your head down. You survived. Ruth died when Dorothy was 3 years old. The town doctor called it pneumonia. But the women who prepared her body for burial saw the bruises. They saw the scars. They saw evidence of a life that had been nothing but suffering. And still, they said nothing. Dorothy Mae Hutchins was raised by her grandfather, the man who was almost certainly her father, in a house where the definitions of family had already been obliterated. And the town of Crestfall watched it happen in real time, with full knowledge, and they chose silence. Because silence was easier, Silence didn't require courage. Silence didn't demand that you look at yourself in the mirror and ask what kind of person you really were. Dorothy May never went to school past the 3rd grade. The official record states she stopped attending in 1923 when she was 9 years old. The teacher at the time, a woman named Helen Cordray, wrote in her personal diary that Dorothy came to school with marks on her arms and legs that couldn't be explained by normal childhood accidents. She wrote that the girl was painfully thin, that she wore the same dress for weeks at a time, and that she flinched whenever an adult moved too quickly near her. Helen Cordray reported her concerns to the county superintendent. A letter was sent to Samuel Hutchins. He never responded. Dorothy never returned to school, and Helen Cordray, in her diary entry from October 1923, wrote simply, "I have failed her. God forgive me, I have failed her." That diary wasn't discovered until 2003 in an estate sale by a local historian who was researching the town's educational records. By then, everyone involved was long dead. What happened to Dorothy between 1923 and 1931 can only be pieced together from fragments. A doctor's record from 1927 shows she was treated for a broken wrist. The notes say she fell. Another record from 1929 shows she was treated for infected lacerations on her back. The notes say she was injured while working in the barn. There are no photographs of Dorothy as a child, no school records beyond 3rd grade, no church records because the Hutchins family didn't attend church. Samuel called it a waste of time. What we do know comes from the testimonies of neighbors, given decades later when they were old and dying and finally willing to speak. One woman, Clara Dennison, told her granddaughter in 1978 that she used to see Dorothy working in the yard, chopping wood, hauling water from the creek, doing the labor of a grown man while she was still a child. Clara said she once tried to give Dorothy a biscuit through the fence. Samuel saw it happen and dragged the girl inside by her hair. Clara never tried again. Another neighbor, a man named Ernest Polk, admitted in a recorded interview in 1985 that he'd heard screaming coming from the Hutchins property on multiple occasions. Late at night, a girl's voice, begging. He said everyone heard it, and everyone turned up their radios or closed their windows and pretended they didn't, because Samuel Hutchins was not a man you crossed, because the Hutchins family had always been strange, always been isolated, and people convinced themselves it wasn't their business, that whatever happened in that house was between them and God. By the time Dorothy May turned 16, she had lived an entire lifetime of horrors. She had no friends, no allies, no concept of what a normal family even looked like. She had only ever known one man, one authority, one world, and that world was about to tighten around her throat in a way that even the people of Crestfall, who had seen so much and said so little, could no longer pretend not to notice. The marriage license was filed on June 3rd, 1931. Dorothy May Hutchins, age 17. Samuel Hutchins, age 72. The county clerk who processed the paperwork was a man named Donald Fremont. He held that position for 37 years. In 1964, 3 years before he died, he gave an interview to a local journalist working on a history of the county. When asked about unusual marriages he'd processed, he mentioned the Hutchins wedding. He said he remembered it clearly because of the age difference. He said Dorothy barely looked at him. She stared at the floor the entire time. He said Samuel did all the talking, answered all the questions, signed all the papers. The journalist asked him why he didn't refuse to process it. Donald Fremont said, "It wasn't illegal. She was of age. He wasn't married to anyone else. What was I supposed to do?" The journalist pressed him, asked if he knew they were related. Fremont went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I knew there were rumors, but rumors aren't proof, and I wasn't about to go accusing a man based on gossip." The wedding took place on June the 10th, 1931, in the parlor of Samuel Hutchins' house. There was no church ceremony, no reception, no guests beyond the circuit preacher who performed the service and 2 witnesses pulled in from neighboring farms. One of those witnesses, a man named Jacob Torrance, later told his son that the whole thing felt wrong. He said Dorothy looked like she was sleepwalking, that she repeated her vows in a monotone voice like someone reciting words in a language they didn't understand. He said when Samuel kissed her, she went rigid, completely still. like an animal playing dead. Jacob said he went home that night and got drunk for the first time in 15 years because he couldn't get the image out of his head, but he didn't report it. He didn't tell anyone in authority. He just tried to forget. The marriage was legal. It was documented. It was witnessed by a man of God and recorded in the county archives, and no one stopped it. Not the clerk, not the preacher, not the witnesses, not the neighbors who had heard the screaming, not the teacher who had seen the bruises, not the doctor who had treated the broken bones. They all knew something was deeply, horrifically wrong, and they all chose their own comfort over her safety, because stopping it would have required them to admit what they had been ignoring for years. It would have required them to acknowledge that they lived in a town where a man could destroy his own daughter, then marry his own granddaughter, and face no consequences. It would have required them to look at themselves and admit they were complicit, so they didn't. They signed the papers, they performed the ceremony, they went home, and Dorothy Mae Hutchins, at 17 years old, became Dorothy Mae Hutchins again. Same last name, same prison, same nightmare. Except now it had the legal protection of the state of Pennsylvania behind it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Dorothy gave birth to her first child in April of 1932, a boy. He was born in the house delivered by the same midwife who had delivered Dorothy herself nearly 18 years earlier. The midwife's name was Agnes Wardle. In a letter written to her sister in 1947, discovered in a box of correspondence at a Pennsylvania Historical Society, Agnes described that night. She wrote that Dorothy hemorrhaged badly during the delivery, that she was malnourished, anemic, and should have been in a hospital. She wrote that Samuel refused to allow it, that he stood in the doorway the entire time, watching, making sure Agnes didn't try to take Dorothy anywhere. Agnes wrote that when the baby was born, Dorothy held him for less than a minute before Samuel took the infant from her arms. She wrote that Dorothy turned her face to the wall and didn't make a sound, not a cry, not a word. Just silence. Agnes wrote, "I have delivered over 200 babies in my 40 years as a midwife. I have never seen a mother look at her child the way that girl looked at hers, like she was mourning him before he'd even taken his first breath." The boy's name was Samuel Jr. He died before his second birthday. The death certificate lists the cause as fever. There's no other documentation, no doctor's examination, no follow-up, just a small burial in the family plot on the ridge, marked with a wooden cross that rotted away decades ago. Dorothy gave birth again in 1934, another boy. He lived 4 months. Cause of death, unknown. Listed simply as failure to thrive. In 1936, she gave birth to a girl. The baby was stillborn. In 1938, another boy. He survived. His name was Raymond, and Raymond Hutchins would grow up to be the key that eventually unlocked this entire nightmare, though he wouldn't live long enough to see it. By 1940, Dorothy had given birth 5 times. She was 26 years old and looked 50. A photograph exists from this period, taken by a traveling photographer who came through Crestfall offering portraits for $1. Samuel paid for one. It's the only photograph of Dorothy as an adult. She's standing beside Samuel on the porch of the house. Her hair is pulled back severely. Her face is gaunt, hollowed out, her eyes completely vacant. She's not smiling. She's not frowning. She's simply not there. It's the face of someone whose soul has vacated the premises, but whose body continues to perform the necessary functions of survival. Samuel, meanwhile, looks directly at the camera with something that can only be described as satisfaction, ownership, pride, even. The people of Crestfall knew Dorothy was having children. They knew she never left the property. They knew she had no contact with anyone outside the house except when absolutely necessary. And they continued to do nothing. Because by this point, the conspiracy of silence had been going on for so long that breaking it would mean admitting their own guilt. It would mean confronting the fact that they had allowed a child to be abused, raped, married, and imprisoned for over a decade. So they kept quiet. They avoided the Hutchins property. They crossed the street when they saw Samuel in town, and Dorothy Mae Hutchins disappeared from public consciousness entirely. She became a ghost, a rumor, a cautionary tale that people whispered about but never actually addressed, until Raymond grew up and started asking questions. Raymond Hutchins was 12 years old when Samuel died in 1950. The old man was 89. He died in his sleep, in his bed, in the same house where he had committed atrocities for over 3 decades. There was no investigation into his death, no autopsy. He was buried in the family plot beside the children who hadn't survived, and the town of Crestfall breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster was gone. The problem was solved. Except it wasn't, because Dorothy was still alive, and Raymond was just beginning to understand that his childhood had been anything but normal. Dorothy never spoke about what had happened to her, not to Raymond, not to anyone. After Samuel's death, she became even more withdrawn, more silent, as if his absence had removed the last tether keeping her connected to the world. She would sit for hours staring at nothing. She stopped maintaining the house, stopped cooking. Raymond, at 12, had to learn to take care of both of them. He took odd jobs around town, cutting grass, hauling firewood, doing whatever people would pay him for. And the people of Crestfall, perhaps feeling some belated sense of guilt, gave him work. They were kind to him. They never explained why. Raymond noticed things. He noticed that people looked at his mother with pity and fear. He noticed that when he told people his last name, they went quiet. He noticed that there were no photographs in his house, no family Bible, no records of any kind. When he asked his mother about his father, she wouldn't answer. When he asked about his grandparents, she turned away. When he asked why they lived alone, why they had no relatives, why no one ever visited, she would leave the room. In 1956, when Raymond was 18, he tried to enlist in the army. Part of the enlistment process required a birth certificate. He went to the county courthouse to get a copy. That's when he essayed. Wait. Father, Samuel Hutchins. Mother, Dorothy Mae Hutchins. He asked the clerk if there was a mistake. She looked at the record. Then she looked at him. And she said something that would haunt Raymond for the rest of his life. No mistake, son. That's what it says. Raymond asked what she meant. The clerk, an older woman named Phyllis Crane, hesitated. Then she said, "Your mother and your father had the same last name before they were married. That's all I can tell you." Raymond stood there in that courthouse as the pieces started to come together. He went home. He confronted Dorothy. He demanded answers. And for the first time in her life, Dorothy Mae Hutchins spoke the truth out loud. She told him everything. How Samuel was her grandfather, how he was also likely her father, how she'd been forced to marry him, how she'd tried to run away once when she was 15, and he'd beaten her so badly she couldn't walk for a week, how the town knew, how they all knew, and how no one had ever helped her. Raymond left Crestfall that night. He enlisted under a different name. He never came back. But before he left, he did one thing. He went to the sheriff, a man named Thomas Ridley. He told him everything his mother had said. He begged him to do something, to investigate, to arrest someone, to acknowledge what had happened. Sheriff Ridley listened, and when Raymond was finished, the sheriff said, "Your grandfather is dead, son. Your mother is free. What do you want me to do? Arrest a corpse? Drag this town's name through the mud for something that happened 20 years ago? Best thing you can do is leave and never look back." So Raymond did. And the town of Crestfall sealed its secret one final time. Dorothy Mae Hutchins died in 1964. She was 50 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the real cause was simpler than that. She had simply stopped living decades earlier. Her body had just taken its time catching up. She was buried in the family plot next to Samuel, next to the children who hadn't survived. There was no funeral, no obituary, no mourning. She left the world as quietly as she had lived in it. For the next 30 years, the story of Dorothy Mae Hutchins existed only in fragments, in whispered conversations between elderly residents who were dying and suddenly wanted to confess, in the guilt-ridden memories of people who had looked the other way, in the nightmares of Raymond Hutchins, who died in 1989 in Oregon, thousands of miles from Crestfall, without ever speaking to anyone about his mother again. The truth finally came to light because of a genealogist. Her name was Dr. Laura Pembroke, a researcher from Penn State University who was conducting a study on genetic isolation in rural Appalachian communities. In 1996, she was going through county records in rural Pennsylvania, looking for families who had remained in the same location for multiple generations. She found the Hutchins family, and when she started mapping their family tree, she realized something was very, very wrong. The dates didn't make sense. The relationships were impossible. She cross-referenced birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, death certificates, and slowly the full scope of what had happened became clear. Samuel Hutchins had likely fathered his own daughter, Ruth. Ruth had given birth to Dorothy, making Samuel both grandfather and father. Then Samuel had married Dorothy and fathered at least one surviving child with her, Raymond. The bloodline had folded in on itself so completely that untangling it required genetic analysis that wouldn't be available for another decade. Dr. Pembroke published her findings in 1998 in an academic journal on genetic anthropology. The paper was titled Generational Incest and Community Complicity, a case study from rural Pennsylvania. It included the Hutchins family, though she changed the names. But researchers in Pennsylvania knew exactly which town she was talking about. The story made regional news. A few small newspapers picked it up. One journalist tracked down surviving residents of Crestfall and asked them if they knew. Every single one admitted they had heard rumors. Most admitted they had suspected. None admitted they could have done anything about it. They were old now, in their 70s and 80s, and they offered the same excuse that had been offered for 70 years. It wasn't their business. It wasn't their place. Times were different then. What could they have done? In 2003, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Webb traveled to Crestfall to make a short film about the case. He interviewed 12 people who had lived in the town during the 1930s and 1940s. All of them admitted they knew something was wrong with the Hutchins family. Not one of them had ever reported it. When Marcus asked why, an 87-year-old woman named Edith Kowalski said something that became the closing line of his film. "We told ourselves it wasn't our fault, that we didn't know for sure, that maybe we were wrong, but we weren't wrong. We knew, we all knew. And we let it happen anyway because stopping it would have meant admitting we were the kind of town that let things like that happen. So we protected ourselves, and we sacrificed her." Dorothy Mae Hutchins spent her entire life being sacrificed by her grandfather, by her town, by a system that valued reputation over human life. She never had a childhood, never had a choice, never had a voice, and when she died, she was buried next to the man who had destroyed her in a town that had enabled him every step of the way. The only reason we know her story now is because someone finally decided to look, to ask questions, to refuse the silence. Crestfall, Pennsylvania still exists. About 150 people live there now. Most of them don't know this story, or if they do, they don't talk about it. The Hutchins property was abandoned in the 1970s. The house collapsed in the 1990s. All that remains is the foundation, overgrown with weeds, and a family plot on the ridge with markers so weathered you can barely read the names anymore. But the story survives, not because anyone wanted it to, but because some truths are too dark to stay buried forever. And Dorothy Mae Hutchins deserves to be remembered, not as a victim without a name, but as a person who suffered unimaginable horrors while the world watched and did nothing. Her story is a reminder of what happens when good people choose silence, when communities prioritize comfort over courage, when we tell ourselves that someone else's nightmare isn't our responsibility. She was 17 years old on her wedding day, and she married the man who had been destroying her since birth, and an entire town let it happen. That's the truth they tried to bury, and now you know it too.